Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Conversations in Time podcast. So, over to the guys.
Hello, and welcome to another Conversations in Time podcast. I'm John N.
And I'm Ian G.
So hopefully there won't be any noticeable difference on the voice quality because we have had to change how we record. Thank you. Is it Microsoft who've killed off
Skype, yeah.
Skype, the usual very easy that we use.
Yeah, very easily usable, very intuitive, free means of recording voice calls. I can't have that, can we? We can't have that. No. It's kind of, it fits into the current economic environment of destroying everything that actually previously worked for 100 years. But anyway.
It's like yours was over 100 years.
Well, exactly, but you know what I mean. It's vandals. Anyway.
So hopefully people won't notice anything different. We won't know until I've actually done the edit, and we'll see how it goes. But anyway, on with the show, as they say. I can see we've got the videos on this one as well, so I can see Ian's on it. Board.
It's like a oxygen. It's mid-afternoon nap. Homes under a hammer. No, that's earlier today, wasn't it? So.
I was trying to think of the Alan Partridge one, mid-afternoon matters. He called it mid-afternoon matters. That's right. Anyway.
Mind doth boggle, as they say, but anyway.
Right, so we're on the counterfactual, maybe not bus this time, we're on the counterfactual sailing ship.
Really speaking, it was a steamship, but anyway, let's go.
Well, it was a steamship, fair enough.
Or a ship with a steam engine, whether it used it, that was just, well, anyway, let's not get into all that. But anyway, yeah.
Now here we are, it's the 1850s, and something isn't going to happen, rather than something is going to happen. Although we've had plenty of something didn't happen before anyway. So what isn't going to happen then, Ian?
So Matthew Perry, not the guy from Friends, but a Commodore. Yeah,
not that one.
A Commodore, which is an interesting rank, but that's for another podcast. In the U.S. Navy, went to Japan on a couple of occasions. I discovered, it's to try and persuade them to open up their country to trade, which again is quite odd given the current environment. You think he was, but anyway. So, which he was obviously fairly successful in as much as that.
Well, I don't know whether he persuaded him, did he? Didn't he go in with a gunship and said, if you don't open trade, I'm going to start shooting?
Well, I think I've got no evidence of that in some of the sources I looked at. I think that's become a bit of an urban myth.
Yeah, but it just feels like, it just seems slightly strange that he just turned up and they went, oh yeah, we'll trade, when plenty of other countries had been trying to trade as well. And
from what I was reading, the trade thing, although it was important, was just one of a number of things which they wanted, which kind of made more sense in the terms of giving support to any shipwrecked sailors and stuff. And the Americans had a very big whaling fleet, so shipwrecked sailors around Japan were not uncommon. So it was on the list. I mean, America wasn't a great exponent of free trade in the 1850s. To be fair, no country was really. But yes, that was part of it. I don't know. I agree with you. My personal knowledge, such as it was that he laid his guns on Tokyo. But in reality, those small ships carrying small cannons, how much damage could he do? But when I've looked at it subsequently, I can't see any reference to that.
But then he was Navy, so he was military. It wasn't. Well, I've been trader.
I know, but he was a representative of the government, and the interesting thing about how else would somebody from America have got to Japan in the 1850s, considering it was closed to trade. So you couldn't just turn up in a trading ship. I mean, he could have got on a whaling ship as some sort of ambassador or something. But so I think the Navy bit wasn't a deliberate show of force as such. It was just an obvious means of getting a load of.
I'm looking at Wiki, which I'm assuming you looked at. So it says in 1852 he was assigned, and I think you're right in what you're saying. It says he was assigned a mission by Millard Fillmore, who was the president at the time. I don't know which one. 13th. Obviously, the 13th president of the US, and to force the opening. So he was sent to force the opening of Japanese ports to American trade through the use of gunboat diplomacy, if necessary.
Yeah, but gunboat diplomacy doesn't necessarily mean you turn up and lay your guns on people. I mean, it just...
Well, you've got to have a gunboat to have gunboat diplomacy.
Well, indeed, but if you're in the Navy, by definition, it's a gunboat or a boat with guns. But yeah, anyway, that's kind of an irrelevance. But yeah, so he turned up and said... But from what I've read since we discussed this, that his first mission wasn't a success, but it wasn't a failure. It was never meant. He basically he laid some suggestions in the normal, charming American fashion to the Japanese, and said, "I will let you think about it." And then he came back with some extra ships and said, "Right, what's your answer then?" Maybe he was laying these guns on him at that point, and then
So I'm just looking at. So all right. So his first visit, he fired 73 blank shots. So he had 73 cannons, and they all fired one blank shot, which he claimed was in celebration of American independence. So this was when he actually pointed the guns at the shore. He didn't
that's fairly common for ships entering harbour, isn't it? That's like the gun salute, but I suppose it's easy to look at that in hindsight and say, "Oh well, it was only blanks," and yeah.
So I mean, he did apparently say, what was it? The Japanese asked him to leave. It says Perry attempted to intimidate the Japanese by presenting them a white flag and a letter which told them if they chose to fight, the Americans would destroy them. And then he fired 73 cannon. Perry shipped. They got new I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right. PAIXHANS.
It's not country in Spanish or something.
Passion gun says the first naval gun designed to fire explosive shells.
Oh, okay, yeah, all right.
So, he didn't fire. It doesn't look like he fired any live rounds, but he was intimidating. I think that's the. Yep. He didn't just say, because they wanted him to leave. I mean, there's no doubt about that. The Japanese wanted him out and gone, and he wouldn't go show his strength by doing what he did. And that was on his first visit, like you say.
Yeah.
So I'm just looking at the second. I should have done this before, shouldn't I? So.
Well, second visit. So on his second visit, they had a conversation, and they agreed a treaty, which essentially was opening up Japanese ports for shipwrecked sailors. So they would put missions in a building essentially for sailors in distress, but then obviously opening up the Japanese market to trade. Although it also opened up the Japanese market, such as it was, because I wouldn't imagine it was particularly sophisticated, but obviously in terms of goods in and goods out, which was the market for other countries as well. The other countries being the other imperial countries of the era, the usual suspects of France and Great Britain.
Well, according to Wiki on his second one, I mean, it's just interesting stuff to read, to be honest. So, February the 13th, 1854. So he returned with 10 ships, 1,600 men. American leadership designed the show of force to command fear and astound the Orientals. That was the language at the time.
The language of the time, Wikipedia, makes you wonder. The trouble with Wikipedia is you have no idea who's written.
Oh, I know, yeah. So, it's...
There's part of it, and ChatGPT says it was 7 ships the second time round.
All right.
But then you've no idea.
It says after initial resistance, whatever that was, I don't think it was anything serious. Perry was permitted to land at Kanagawa, near Yokohama, and then they signed this convention of Kanagawa.
Yeah.
And he got given $500,000 when he got back. Well, $500,000 in today's money.
Right.
I know.
What, for doing his job?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, Congress voted in.
What a very strange country it is and became. But anyway, not Japan, by the way. But yeah, okay. So the interesting thing is, and it fits into the what if to some extent, is why and what is this? What is the attraction of the Japanese home islands in terms of trade? What have they got that's so worthwhile? What is their buying power, if you know what I mean? So what is it so it's semi-feudal. So what is it they want, or what is it the Americans think they want? Do they want?
Well, no. So as I understand it, and this was what I got, was that Japan had been very introvert, for 200 years, and they'd been trading. It wasn't as if they weren't trading with anybody; they were trading with China. So they weren't totally in isolation. And there was this trading area in Nagasaki that I think they were getting some modern, more modern type goods through that port. And people were starting to think, well, look, I'm fed up of being in a medieval, what's the word? Feudal society.
But what were
these new gadgets things that were starting to appear?
Yeah, but anybody could. I mean, at a domestic level or a country level, anybody can say that. How do you pay for it? What's your, I can't say the word, collateral, for a better expression? What?
Well, so I don't know what
Unless you take over a
Japan was
country,
creating.
yeah,
So I mean, Japan obviously had some goods like silks. It did. There was some arty crafty type stuff. I mean, it's not a big country for gold, so it's not as if it's going to have a lot of gold.
very few, whatever the word is.
Yeah, natural resources. So the Americans must have thought it had something to trade that was of value to them. What it was, I don't know, but I'm assuming it was something that was Japanese. Let's face it, there is Japanese furniture and stuff like that that people, but even in this country, you see on antique shows where it's like, oh yeah, this is Japanese lacquer wood, blah blah blah. I'm just using that as an example.
No, I mean, the long and short of it is, hopefully one of our listeners will know and can tell us on Twitter. Well, not on Twitter because we don't tend to use that so much anymore, but Facebook and Blue Sky. But yeah, okay. But I mean, well, obviously it wouldn't be technology because it's 1850, so technology, as we understand it, doesn't really exist. Natural resources were relatively little. I mean, it may have just been, what's the term, rights to do stuff, not necessarily on land. I mean, it could have been access to the sea for whaling. Although strictly speaking, I don't know when, they wouldn't have been able to interrupt the American whaling fleet to any degree anyway. But and you tend to do that out, far out at sea, not in coastal waters. So it's not that. But then I suppose,
yeah, I mean, it could have been silks. I mean, they did the Japanese do create their own silk goods, don't they? I mean, they didn't import silk from China, and because if they were trading with China, they had to trade with something.
Yeah,
the Chinese would want. So yeah, it's a shame we don't know what the attraction was in the first place. How are you going to have somebody must have thought, hang on, this island is very interesting. They got loads of stuff that we want to buy off them, and they won't sell it to us.
Right. So according to the internet, they wanted access to the harbours essentially for their whaling ships. So safe anchorages, places to refuel. It was seen as a market for American goods. You're right about it. They were interested in Japanese goods like silk, tea, and ceramics. So you mentioned that. That's good. All those years watching Antiques Roadshow.
I know, yeah, paid off. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hundreds of the sledgehammer.
Protection for shipwrecked sailors.
That's right, yeah, because they used to execute them.
So I don't know, but I suspect if we were experts in this, I suspect it has the whiff to me of somebody's bee under the bonnet. That somebody in America had a bee under their bonnet, and what that basically means is a personal interest in something for no apparent reason. If it's not a term that the listeners are familiar with.
Well, it could be that they weren't necessarily. Yeah, I mean, it could be that they wanted
great strategy.
Yeah, I mean, it could be that they wanted to extend their influence across the Pacific.
Yeah,
not necessarily through sort of like having the port
if you look at Japan in terms of just a geographical place, it's key for the Pacific in the sense of it guards, inverted commas, the Chinese mainland from anybody else to a certain extent. It extends that down into China, up into what became parts of Russia. So having relationships with Japan's obvious, because if you're starting to look globally, because you think, well, I can't get into China or Indochina for whatever purpose without going past Japan. It's the Pacific by definition is huge. Yes, there's islands there, but it's a long way even from Hawaii. There's lots of little islands, but they don't have any resources. They don't have any people. So having safe anchorages for your whaling fleet and all the rest of it, and then you think, well, if I'm going to do that, why don't I see if I can buy stuff from them, sell stuff? So I doubt it was, people were thronging through the streets of New York, burning things down, saying, I demand trading with Japan now. It was just a thing to do. And I suspect, had it been anywhere else, and for all we know, it happened elsewhere, but if it hadn't been anywhere else, if Japan hadn't, become a major industrial power and been a belligerent in the Second World War and had its 1960s revolution and its 1980s financial impact on America, etc., become the second biggest, if not the second biggest economy for a large chunk of the 70s and 80s. Nobody would know about Perry, but it's arguably a bit in hindsight. Now, you could argue maybe that, and this is what we're going to have to chat about, you could argue that Perry doing what he did started all that, but it's a bit chicken and egg, in terms of why they did it. They had no intention.
For me, I think that there might have been a bit of not that America has an empire or ever wants an empire, but there's a, like you say, safe haven for their ships if they ever wanted to then trade or
with the rest of their empire in the Philippines. Yeah,
that's right. To move into
and North America and stuff,
China and Korea, and to trade or and it gives them. Let's face it, maybe they saw Japan as an easy look. If we need to have military bases, then we'll just go in.
Well, I don't know it was military. I think it's more.
Well, if it came to it, is what I meant. Yeah, not specifically to put them in.
Yeah, it's more about their trading for their whaling fleet, and
that's wrong. Yeah.
Their trading fleet. I mean, because Japan and China at that period was just starting to be exploited by European countries in terms of these various trading. What's the word where you take over a? I can't think of the word, but you take over a chunk of a country and run it as a trading area. You don't necessarily take over the country itself. I can't think there's a term for it, but I can't think what it is. And America did have one of those areas. Not at this point, but later in the 19th century. The word almost went through my neurons and whizzed away again. But anyway, there's a term for a free trading area, run outside the control of the governing country and without their really happy approval of it. That there was half a dozen of those that France, Britain, Germany, various other countries had along the Chinese coast. America had one later on. So yeah, they were interested in that trading, but not taking over the country as such.
Okay, so we've talked about what did happen and why it happened. So let's talk about what happened. What would happen if it didn't happen? Say the Americans were focused on something else and didn't, for whatever reason, Japan wasn't on their agenda.
Or they called his bluff and said, "Well, okay, with your little cannons, I don't think you're going to destroy Japan, are you? It's hardly an atomic bomb, is it?" So, yeah, okay.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, he would have failed. I mean, let's face it. Japan would have had a very difficult time trying to enforce a military invasion of a country at the other side of the Pacific.
America, would you mean? You said Japan. Did you mean America?
Sorry, I meant America.
Yeah. No, indeed. Well, it had a tiny army, and it was just
1,600 men with a lot of cannon. Yeah, I mean they could do a lot of damage on the shore where they were firing, but that's about it.
Yes.
They wouldn't have taken over Japan, and ultimately they probably who knows what would have happened. They would have lost.
Yeah, and the 7 ships must have been a significant portion of the American Navy at the time as well. So it's not as if they could turn up with all 150. So, but yeah. So, but I think Japan was in flux anyway. It was from what I've gathered, it had a number of landlords. What are we talking about? Warlords called shoguns, as most people.
There's only one shogun.
Isn't there? Well,
yeah.
Shu.
Yep.
Isn't it always a shogun in waiting? I don't mean the heir to the throne. Is there not always a sort of a successor waiting to take over?
You mean an heir?
Not in the strictest. It doesn't have to be a.
I don't think so.
Well, okay. I thought I'd read that, but
so I mean the shogunate that was in power at the time was the Tokugawa shogunate.
That didn't cover the whole of the Japanese home island, surely.
It did, yeah.
What? But also, there's 3 major home islands. You're going to know what the third one. What he covered?
Well, I don't know. I don't know enough about the main bit where Edo, and Tokyo and all of the main cities.
Onshu, Kyushu, and somewhere over there.
Yes, but I mean, with the Northern Island, that's I don't know when that became. Isn't that one disputed with Russia as to?
There's the Kuril Islands, which are.
That's right. But I think that, and I'm only going on what I read from a James Clavell novel, Shogun, brilliant book, one of the best books I've ever read, and a great TV program now. Now they've made a good version of it. I'm sure he described the Northern Island as they weren't Japanese as such. They were sort of separate from the Japanese that were on the Middle Island sort of thing. So I don't know whether the shogunate actually covered up the whole of Japan as we would know it today. Yeah. But there is only one shogun. There's only one emperor, and there was one shogun, and he was the strongest. What they call daimyo, I think it's daimyo, which is like feudal lord. So they had their own fiefdom that they controlled, and that's how they got very much like what happens everywhere else. You got a warlord who's got his own land, makes his money from his peasants and all this sort of stuff. And he has his samurai to fight for him and all this sort of malarkey. At the time, I think as you were saying, there were a lot of things going on in Japan, and the existing shogunate was struggling because there was a lot of economic difficulties, and some of that was because of the discontent among samurai. Don't know what that discontent was caused by. Maybe because they weren't fighting. Who knows? And then what I've got here is also that it was the influence of Western ideas. So it wasn't just Western technology. I think there was Western ideas, maybe of democracy, or people having a right to vote, or stuff like, having a bit more of a say in what goes on, and not just being, at the whim of your overlord.
Well, exactly, not being a total feudal a feudal society. I mean, that had been since the Age of Enlightenment, which was at least 200 or 300 years before this period. It was hardly sweetness and light as a result, but that was done away with in Europe 200 or 300 years beforehand, wasn't it? So
that's right. I mean, I think you have to accept that the societies in Japan and in China, were very different, aren't they? The concept of anything other than the guy in charge having ultimate power over everybody. There's no democracy. There's no sharing of power with anybody.
Yeah, and obviously
religious type thing.
There wasn't. I mean, arguably, that was debatable at the highest levels in Europe and America. But certainly, what the difference being is that, presumably in Japan and China, that trickled down to the very lowest levels. So it was, to be honest, it was samurai I was thinking rather than shogun, but it doesn't really matter now. But the local samurai who would have this biggest house in the village and some servants and some thugs on his side, you couldn't challenge him. So it's not even a sense of you couldn't challenge the king or the prime minister or the president. There was some bloke at the bottom of your street. Through feudalistic loyalty, you couldn't cross, because he would either deal with you direct, or if there was 5 of you, he would turn it with 10, because he'd get his samurai mate saying, "Look, this guy at the end of my street is causing problems for the people in the town and the village and the area," and so it's the whole layers, no doubt. Feudalism had lots of layers, because every thug was dependent on his fellow thugs in enforcing the rules. So I guess it was that people would be pushing up against. I mean, they wouldn't, because obviously it was ultimately replaced with the emperor, who was still all-seeing person, but the local thug was got rid of.
I mean, ultimately, I don't know what the society, even if you look at Japan in the 20th century, before the Second World War, before it all got changed, I don't know what it had evolved into. I think there was some level of democracy, wasn't there? They got obviously there wasn't a shogun anymore, and I don't.
I mean, democracy is it is the various types. I think it's a rule of law, isn't it? It's the rule of law is what makes a civilized country. Democracy.
Yeah, that's right. Yes.
It's not just my whim. I don't like you, so I can beat you up and kill you. That's not a society run by the rule of law, is it? Whereas certainly in the 20th century, notwithstanding its problems, Japan was a society that was run by the rule of law.
I'm just looking. So one of the things that did happen as a consequence of Perry was that there was something called. This was 1860. Where is it? 1868. So that's a few years after. It was called the Meiji, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Meiji Restoration.
Yeah.
Which was also known as the Honourable Restoration. It was a political event which restored imperial rule to Japan under Emperor Meiji. All right. But I think they'd taken over from the Tokugawa shogunate, and they wanted to modernise. So ultimately, the Tokugawa shogun didn't want modernisation. Perry came in, and that enabled enough change in Japan so that they had a change of ruler, if you want to look at it like that, to somebody who was more into industrialisation and modernisation of Japan, in line with all of the countries that were doing trade with it at the time. So
Well, the question is, there's two questions. There's certainly one question is if Perry hadn't been there, would these changes have gone through anyway? And the other question, which is arguably slightly more is they wouldn't have gone through. What would that have?
That's right, yeah. It wouldn't have gone through, or they'd have been a lot slower. There's no doubt about that. So let's assume that they wouldn't have gone through. Well, it had trickled through. So they would have been a very much more rural country rather than an industrial country. So, I mean, if you look at the lead up to the First World War, then again, wasn't there there was a conflict between Russia and Japan before the First World War, wasn't it?
Over Korea, essentially, yeah.
And they were heavily industrialised then, weren't they? Japan. I mean, they
were fully
had a big
industrialised.
navy.
They had a big navy, and they had an industrialised army as on the Western European model.
So that likely wouldn't have happened then. So Japan, without Perry, Japan wouldn't have been anywhere near as strong at the time.
No, because there's plenty of other countries in well, there's at least one that springs to mind. There's other countries in that general part of the world which didn't industrialise until arguably the last 20, 30 years. And Japan could easily have gone down those lines. I think of Thailand in particular. Thailand's the most obvious one, but then, because it's the one that's not been affected by invasions and stuff, but then there's obviously Vietnam and Cambodia and stuff, and now they've been invaded at least by 3 different people in the last 100 years, so Thailand was kind of annexed by Japan, but it wasn't really invaded, and it was left alone to a large extent. It was annexed, but not really invaded or such, but in as much as they didn't fight back. But so would Japan have been a Thailand, and would other countries have let Japan be a Thailand? A country, semi-feudal, mostly agricultural, minding its own business, doing things to itself that people might not agree with, but they'd let them get away with it because it's nothing to do with me. Or would somebody have come for Japan? And the great expansion of imperial countries in Africa was only in the last 20 years of the 19th century. So it's not as if the European countries in particular, and the Americans as well, had given up. Well, they'd never done anything in Africa, to be fair, but they had given up taking over. I mean, America took over the Philippines in the 1890s. It's not as if they'd given up taking over countries, from the 1860s. They were still doing it well into the late 1880s. So would somebody have come for Japan, and what would, try to take it over? Would America ultimately have come again? And had it been rebuffed by one form or another, would it have been more aggressive? Would it have literally tried to take over?
I suppose, I mean, you could look at which were the ones that were more antagonistic at the time, and they would have been the closer countries like Russia or China. I don't think China had any expansion.
No, China had China had its own problems. It was broken.
Yeah.
It was split up with warlords, and it had these terms that I can't remember the name of, but they had European settlements, for whatever. That's still not quite right. It was no intention to send people there, but it was all about business. But they had half a dozen settlements up and down the Yangtze River area in particular, Shanghai.
So the biggest protagonist then is likely to be Russia.
Yeah,
arguably, and Russia is close enough. It had, had been Western, been industrialising a lot, and we know that they had a conflict anyway. I mean, that's what happened in the real world.
1905, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, that was something that was bubbling up, or the pressures on that were starting.
Yes, the Russians had a modern navy in terms of ironclads and stuff, which in the original timeline was defeated at the Battle of Tsushima by more modern and better tactics from the Japanese. But if we presume that Japan didn't industrialize, or was late in industrializing, but it wouldn't have a significant navy, it would have no means of preventing Russia doing anything anywhere. Now, whether Russia would probably have taken over Korea, or certainly the northern part of Korea, and I don't literally mean North Korea, but the bits of Korea it wanted. It's interesting, actually. I've just remembered that I'm sure I've read something that you might be right, that Russia took over the Kuril Islands at the end of the Second World War, which are quite far north, but it did have some historical claim to to parts of Honshu, which is the big northern island, even. When that goes back to his Henry's guess, a bit like sort of Alaska scenario. So there's definitely claims and counterclaims. Russia could have attempted to take parts of the Northern Ireland. Stop saying Northern Ireland. Northernmost island of Japan. It may have attempted to take over parts of there. And if it had if there was no Japanese navy to oppose it, it certainly could have made a landing. Whether it could have sustained a landing against even a badly equipped, huge Japanese force, because it certainly wasn't short of people. I mean, even today, it's for its size, it's a heavily populated place in terms of the amount of countryside it's actually capable of marching over or farming, etc. It's very urbanized.
But then that's because they can, they're efficient at producing food
Yes,
to
not high
maintain the
intensity,
population.
Yes, indeed. And rice in particular is very, there's a term for it. One of these days, of all these terms, there's a term for it where for whatever you plant, you get a lot out of it, as opposed to some other plants which you don't.
Energy rich. Or
That's the word. Yeah, well, that's the term. Yeah, so I suspect that Russia could have probably taken over, or probably would have taken over most of Korea. Might have expanded into China, which would have been problems long term, but that's another conversation. And would have taken, or attempted to take, parts of Japan, and probably would have succeeded as far up to a point, and then I think they would have become a bit of a status quo. Now, it then would obviously still with its navy be able to range around Japan, closing it down to further trade. So Japan could have tried to industrialize or increase its output and try to keep the Russians back, but I think it would have been impoverished at best. But that it was like all these things. There's many threads there, but that.
Oh, there are. Yeah, I must admit, I'm sort of looking at Wiki. Yeah, just I know it's amazing the stuff that I should have read before. So apologies to our listeners. Hopefully they'll be fuming enough to write some comments. But so the Russo-Japanese War essentially came out of the Sino-Japanese War as a consequence of that. Something happened in 1895, the Treaty of Shimonoseki. I can't pronounce this. Shimonoseki was the Treaty of Shimonoseki, which was the first Sino-Japanese War. And it was an unequal treaty and ceded the Liaodong Peninsula and Port Arthur to Japan before the Triple Intervention, which Russia, Germany and France forced Japan to relinquish its claim.
I think
Japan feared that Russia would impede its plans to establish a sphere of influence in mainland Asia, especially as Russia built the Trans-Siberian Railroad, making inroads in Korea, and acquired a lease of the Liaodong Peninsula and Port Arthur from China in 1898. Japan signed the Anglo-Japanese Alliance in 1902 and began offering to recognise Russia's dominance in Manchuria in exchange for recognition of Korea as part of Japan's sphere of influence. They were just doing stuff, and then it was rejected by Russia, and then the negotiations broke down, and then Japan opened Japan opened hostilities in a surprise attack on the Russian Pacific Fleet at Port Arthur on the 9th of February 1904.
Yep.
Yeah.
Where is Port? I thought Port Arthur was in.
I always thought you thought in the Port Moresby.
I thought Port Arthur was in Korea. It's actually in China.
Yeah.
It's not called Port Arthur anymore, strangely enough. But yes,
Lushun Port, formerly Port Arthur.
Yeah. So but the long and short of it is, in our alternative timeline, is the Japanese wouldn't be doing any of these things because because they had no means of doing it. They wouldn't have had a modernized Western style army with breech-loading field artillery and rifles and such like, or accurate rifles and formations of infantry and such like, and cavalry. They wouldn't have any of that, and they wouldn't have had a navy, so they would have been very vulnerable to the Russians. Probably could have done anything they liked. I don't think they could have taken over Japan because it's too populous, and they're not it's a different culture, so you can't really just annex a country that's completely different from you. It doesn't work like that. You've got to have some common thread there to make it even possible. Not somebody at my front door. Can you give me 1 minute? Apologies.
Now we could break for a word from our sponsors.
Are you tired of all that slipping, sliding, belly flopping, and face planting on your trampoline?
Introducing from OTEC No, Trampoline Tip Toe, the revolutionary toe grips designed for bouncers who want to stick the landing without sticking the oof.
With Trampoline Tip Toe, you'll bounce like a pro and grip like a dingo, whether you're doing flips, tricks, or just trying to survive family trampoline time. We've at least got your toes covered.
Made from patented and cutting-edge, super grippy but not that sticky technology, these toe grips keep you glued to the mat without gluing you to the ER.
Forget tangled socks or barefoot fails. Trampoline Tip Toe gives you the edge to jump higher, land better, and look, oh, so much cooler.
And let's be honest, isn't it time you stopped your feet from embarrassing you?
Bounce into action today with Trampoline Tiptoe, available in a variety of sizes and colors, from stumped toe black to strained ankle starburst. Oh, techno. They've only gone and blummin' done it again.
Today's episode is sponsored by Techno, helping yesterday, today. Techno is a subsidiary of Uncle Schnookums Enterprises, wholly owned and operated by Deforest Co. Global, pioneers in transforming the world's rainforests into your favorite products. All rights reserved. No claims or returns will be honored.
And we're back. Right. Well, while we were listening to that, I was just reading. It's quite fascinating, Japanese history. After the Perry things, definitely worthwhile. I was looking into that a bit more. There was even one of the things that I did find that. Where's it gone now? Where's it gone? The Americans essentially got the Japanese to. I'll stop waffling. There was an American general who encouraged the Japanese to create a Monroe Principle and have their own sphere of influence over Korea.
So, didn't it? It's
to civilize them, the Taiwanese.
Hopefully, it was hopefully, he was still alive, and he was in Hawaii in 1941 as their Monroe, as their Monroe Principle was being exercised in the Western Pacific. But it shows the unexpected consequences of actions. I mean, to some extent, I was thinking that about the Perry aspect. That little did he know, 90 years later, that the Japanese would be knocking on his door. Not his door, obviously, he'd be dead. But the Americans door going, "Hello, we've fully industrialized now. Can we have Hawaii or whatever?" It's
No, that's right. Yeah, it's just interesting that this Gendre, I think General Gendre, Gendre, and there's American French.
Right. So
General.
So
Anyway.
so what do we think? So do we think Japan would have industrialized, or would it have been Taiwan?
Yes.
Or
No, it would have, but I think that it would have been more akin to a smaller country in that region.
Right.
I'm trying to think. I don't know what Korea was like. I mean, it was obviously seen as uncivilized by the Japanese, in the real world.
It was completely non-industrial. Certainly in the 1800s, it was. I mean, it wasn't particularly industrialized in the 1950s. Never mind the 1850s. So yes, it's completely.
So it depends on whether there was if there would have been more interference from outside. So I think that Japan would have, might have become a smaller. I mean, let's face it. The bottom line is the industrialization would have been slower. What we have to make a decision on is what would that mean if it was half the size or a third of the size or something like that? If the European powers just looked at Japan as, who cares? It's just another island. We'll get there eventually, sort of thing. So they would have been.
I still think it would have been too difficult. Certainly, nobody would have been interested in colonizing it because it would be too difficult. Even if it wasn't industrialized, it wasn't. Invading Japan was never going to be a bag of fun. No such metaphor, but anyway. It's
So I mean, if because there was like this traditionalist faction in Japan as well as the modernization faction. If the traditionalists had stayed in it with their influence for 20 years longer, 25 years longer, it would have had a significant impact on current geopolitical events.
Yeah,
sure it would.
Yeah.
I mean,
so assuming it doesn't get invaded, and I don't think it does. It might lose some territory on its northern areas to Russia. It wouldn't get bogged down in China, which drove a lot of the militarism in the 1920s and 30s. So they wanted to take over China, and then they got bogged down in a war in the late 1930s, and then they ran out of resources, and then the Americans slapped a load of tariffs and bans on them, said to go and get the oil themselves. So they went south into Indonesia and then attacked Hawaii to keep the Americans off their back, blah, blah, blah. And we all know how that ended. It didn't do anything.
It could have been more of a, I mean, I'm just speculating here, but I mean, there could have been, or there could have been more of a desire by, ordinary people for a more Western style democracy.
Yeah, so I think it's possible that it would have been a model. It would have developed into a model like, an average European, an average European country in the late 1890s, 1920s, 30s.
It would have been a distraction as much as anything to the it would have been a minor player, not a major player.
Yeah, but I don't think, and the point as well, it wouldn't have been a militaristic country invading China, invading other countries.
That's
which then brings to the obvious question: would America have joined the Second World War? It would never have been attacked. But anyway, that's
no, I mean that
already. But yeah,
Well, yeah, but like you said, it's funny how to me the argument is they wouldn't have, and so they wouldn't have attacked Japan because they wouldn't have been in the right. They wouldn't have been able to.
You mean Japan wouldn't have attacked? You mean? But
that's right. Yeah, so Japan wouldn't have attacked the US. I mean, what I'm saying is that you're right. Perry would have been a bit gobsmacked if he'd have gone, "Oh, I can't believe that me doing this creates that," and the carnage that caused.
But then the flip side, I suppose you could argue, is America doesn't join the Second World War, and the Russians, as one of our previous podcasts, roll onto the coast in Cali, at the end of the Second World War. But I don't know whether I agree with that, because don't forget, even your view was that the bomb was being developed to drop on Germany. No, but if America
not on Japan.
If America didn't join,
I see what you mean.
There wouldn't be a bomb. But anyway, we're going off at a massive tangent now. But
I mean, I know we're going off at a tangent, and it's almost like that feels like a what if in its own right, as to what Germany wouldn't have signed any agreement. Not that they did anything, but you know what I mean. The Axis powers would include Germany and Italy.
Yeah, but then America wouldn't have joined Britain in its dominions and fighting the Germans. So it would be very much a stalemate, I think, as we discussed.
No, that's right. But I mean, that's a separate. I mean, that feels like a separate.
No, it is. It is
in that one.
We've done that one.
We haven't done now Japan in the Second World War. We haven't. No.
But we've done no America in the Second World War.
No, we haven't done it. We did no America in the First World War.
Right. Okay. Right. Well, all right. You're right. We didn't. We did. Yeah. We did. Well, how did we get? We did at least one.
We did one We did one about Winston Churchill and him.
Right. So we did one where the Russians got to the French coast. I can't think of
well, that was the time. That was our very first episode. Very good episode it was indeed. The Manhattan Project didn't work. That's the one you're thinking of.
Oh, why was that? No, Russian, because the Allied armies beat Germany, or the Western Allies beat Germany.
No, because whatever the name of the operation to take the home islands, I know you know, and I always forget.
Operation Olympic, is it?
Yeah, the one. So they dropped the. Yeah, so where there was going to be 1.5 million casualties on the Allied side, 1 million American and 500,000 British. Yeah, our conclusion was that the appetite for war from America would have just disappeared in terms of trying to do something in Europe. Britain and America would be focused on recapturing territory from the Japanese, and that there just wouldn't be any way of stopping the Russians from just sweeping across Europe.
Yeah, you're right. There's no atomic.
If the bomb stopped them, that was the only thing that realistically stopped them moving forward.
The threat of it, obviously.
The threat of it, yeah. The fact that the Allies, the Americans had it, and they didn't.
Yeah. So going back to Japan then, so we just to summarise, we reckon that Japan would have industrialised. It wouldn't be Thailand, because they obviously have, they have exports already, albeit relatively, but not industrial consumer goods as we'd understand them today, but they are even in the 1950s. But they were producing stuff that people are interested in. They obviously had enough raw materials to make stuff, because they managed to make stuff until they were trading. There's nothing stopping them trading if they wished to, but they wouldn't have been doing it so soon. That would have knocked back the existing timeline. Everything would have been smaller. They wouldn't have had a war with Russia. If they had done it and lost it, that would have killed off any nascent sort of militarism that developed in the original timeline. That doesn't stop developing a military.
I mean, one of the things that we haven't talked about, and it's not something I know a great deal about, is the involvement of Japan in the First World War. And
so there was no as I understand it, as I remember it, they sent some naval forces to the Mediterranean. But that was really just that was just really to join in. But they didn't actually, I don't think they were involved in any active.
So there wasn't any major conflicts.
No, they were They were given at the Treaty of Versailles. They were given some German possessions in the Pacific, some islands and stuff that the Germans had previously had as part of their empire. But they weren't involved in any major conflicts.
All right. So the no Japan in terms of No, Japan in the First World War wouldn't have had any material.
They were at the state of the Allies, but as I said, they
Yeah.
sent some ships, but they weren't involved in any major activities.
So the real thing would have been the Second World.
Yeah.
And obviously what happened in China. Yeah.
Which is depending on who knows when the Second World War started, but in the 1930s.
35, wasn't it?
Anyway, but
37.
Yeah.
Mid-30s, anyway.
Yeah. So no Japan. Well, there wouldn't be any reason to, because Japan wouldn't have been in China. It wouldn't have been subject to American sanctions.
No, but there is another. Sorry, go on. You carry on.
I was going to say they wouldn't have run out of resources. They wouldn't have to go looking for resources. They didn't need it because they wouldn't have been restricted to resources in the first place. I mean, it's interesting. They might have joined the Americans if the Americans had been in the Second World War. If we fought, but maybe they wouldn't have attacked them. So it's also a what if inside a what if.
No, that's right. Yeah, who would they have fought? It's
they
sending troops to Europe.
Well, the Australians managed, the New Zealanders and the South Africans managed to send plenty of troops.
But then that was because of the Commonwealth, wasn't it? Right.
Well, indeed, but then it didn't have to. I mean, as I said, Japan could have chosen to do that. I think it might have. I'm just throwing it out there.
I don't think so. The thing that's, I don't know your view on this. Post the Second World War, so the reindustrialization of Japan after the Second World War, and Japan's influence on the miniaturization of technology. That was one of the things that you can point to that came out of Japan. Electronics got a lot smaller because of Japanese electronics firms, making things smaller. If they weren't there to do that, do you think that we would have?
Well, you say that.
I don't know.
Japan was notorious in the 1950s and the early 1960s for just ripping everything off. If you Google it as a Brit, you'll find lots of stories on the BBC about. There's a famous bit where Robin Day, who is familiar to us in Britain of a certain age, famous interviewer, confronts the Japanese ambassador with a packet of something from Birmingham and a packet from Japan, and it's exactly the same, literally exactly the same. He goes, "How come it's exactly the same? It's got the same stamp on it." So they were notorious, and then obviously that sort of Hong Kong, I'm using that as a metaphor. That Hong Kong chick copying things was a thing in Japan for a while, and then, as you say, they then moved away from that and had presumably the benefit of their post-war education and started developing stuff and innovating. And so yes, consumer boom of probably the early 70s, the late 60s, or all the way through the 70s was very much in the back of Japanese innovation. But then there's no reason why that wouldn't have happened, because their country wouldn't have been devastated. All right, it was rebuilt with American money.
I know, but that's right. But it wouldn't have been rebuilt with American money because it wouldn't have been decimated. Why would America want to reinvest in a country that?
Then why does any country invest in any other country? Because so they can get some profit out of it, because it's cheap labour, isn't it? But
but they might. But all I'm saying is,
it's harder to explain where the money came from in terms of a conversation. How to explain why the money would have been there. But yes, so it's interesting. But then again, how much of this technology was on the back of patents or research from who knows where? Was all in Japan?
Well, it's just the fact that they drove it so much in terms of making things smaller. I mean, there's another thing as well. This Japanese work ethic that we got indoctrinated with, that wouldn't have been around.
Well, I'm sure we got indoctrinated, right?
Well, there was, I can't remember which one it was, one of those corporate management styles.
Anyway, some British auto manufacturers try to copy it. They've all gone bust. A long time.
I don't think that's because of the way that.
Well, no, but my point being is that it works for Japan because they have a very rigid society. I don't think it works in a Western European society particularly.
Yeah, but don't forget that rigid society wouldn't be there. I suspect the Japanese car industry wouldn't be there. I mean, there's an interesting one, the Japanese car industry, which obviously created a lot of money for Japan as well as the electronics.
Well, why wouldn't it be there?
Because it came out of the industrialization after the Second World War.
Well, it did, but I'm not sure it had much influence on Americans. I mean, Americans make crap cars, so nobody buys them. So I'm not,
Well, they don't buy them outside of America, but they buy a lot of Japanese. Or they have bought a lot of Japanese cars. The rest of the world bought a lot of Japanese.
The reason that people buy Japanese cars is because they're nice and well made. The reason that people don't buy American cars.
But if you haven't got Japanese, if Japan doesn't make cars, then where are you going to get your nice, cheap
Well, no, it's true.
reliable powers from.
Yeah, but then I take the point that he got a massive injection in the early 1950s from aid from America, as did, I don't know if it was the Marshall Plan, if it was strictly speaking called that, but it was the equivalent of. So I take that. But I think they
That would less. I can't see why. Because the Marshall Plan was there because it was a tax incentive for them to do.
Marshall Plan, strictly speaking, but
All right, well, it wasn't done out of altruism. It was done because the companies that were investing were going to make money out of it. You don't want to do that just in a country that wasn't involved in the war. It's a sovereign nation, not really invaded. Why would the Americans invest? They would.
So they can get profit. That's the only thing they're interested in.
Yeah, but there would be other countries in Europe that they could have done.
Well, they did that as well. I mean, in the original timeline, they did both. So there's only so much.
I know, but all I'm saying is if Japan was just another country in Asia.
No, I agree.
Why not Vietnam? Why not?
How did Korea manage to do it? How did Taiwan manage to do it? They weren't given huge sums of American money. Well, Korea certainly was. So
I don't know. We'll have to look at that. We'll have to.
Well, I wouldn't say given sums of money. I mean, they may have been invested, almost certainly invested into by America.
I just don't think that you can say that the Japan would be anywhere near the same as it is today if they weren't involved in the Second World War.
I agree. No, I agree with you. But I think they would. I think it would be a very successful company. I think they'd be in the G, whatever you want, any number you would choose to.
I'm not 100% sure about that. I mean, it might be, but we'll never know. To be fair,
work ethic of the Japanese that we were talking about before, in the innovative stuff. Yes, investment helps, but that wasn't given to them by any third party. They developed that themselves.
No, I know they did, but they took advantage of the ridiculous amounts of money that were being invested into the country.
You can't really knock that, but
that's where it all begins and ends, arguably.
Overall, well, no, I don't know. I just think it takes longer, doesn't it?
Yeah, but that money would have gone elsewhere, and Japan might have come on the tail end of it, but they wouldn't be at the forefront.
No,
I mean, there might still be a
well, you're right. I see. I take your point. They would be a successful country now. They're whizzed away like Taiwan and Korea, but they wouldn't have been the big driving force that they appeared to be in the late 60s and 70s.
That's right. Yeah, they wouldn't have been the powerhouse. The world's number one economy or number two economy.
Yeah. But
so anyway, I think we've got as far as I can with that one before we're going off into thinner threads, and it's all going off at all of the tangents that we always come to when we're that far past the actual date. Yeah. When you're 100 years later, it's or 150 years later or more. Yeah, who knows? There's so many threads that are fanning out. It's pure speculation. Potentially interesting one about Japan not being in the Second World War. That's one for
look at that one.
Anybody out there who has got a strong opinion on that, please let us know.
Anybody out there who's got some knowledge of it, even.
Yeah, well, that's right, yeah.
We're always on the lookout for potential interviewees, people with knowledge, and there even bees under their bonnet who can talk about something,
and shout us down. That's what we need. We need someone to slap us down, say, look, you don't be a fool, such and such and so and so.
Yes. Right.
Anyway, so thanks everybody for listening. Hopefully you enjoyed that one. Any comments, you know where to find us. If you don't, just listen for the next couple of minutes and you'll find out where to get or where you can provide your feedback on Blue Sky or Facebook. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.
Bye.
And that's it. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. But after listening to us natter on, why not let us know what you think? Find us on Blue Sky by searching for Chats in Time. On Facebook, search ORC Time. And on X, we are ORC_time. Until next time, cheerio!